The morning started like any other Thursday in the small town of Riverside. The streets were quiet, with just a few cars passing by and the occasional sound of shop owners opening their businesses. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner. People walked their dogs, sipped their morning coffee, and exchanged friendly waves with neighbors. It was the kind of peaceful scene that made this town feel safe and welcoming. James Harrison was making his way down Maple Street, his white cane tapping rhythmically against the sidewalk. At 61 years old, he had learned to read the world through sound and touch. Every crack in the pavement, every change in the breeze, every distant voice told him where he was and where he needed to go. He knew this route by heart. It was the same path he walked 3 times a week to get to the community center where he volunteered, helping other veterans adjust to life after service. James hadn't always been blind. 12 years ago, he could see the faces of his children, the sunset over the mountains, and the pages of his favorite books. But that all changed during his second tour in Afghanistan. He was a sergeant then, responsible for a small unit of young soldiers who looked up to him like a father figure. One hot afternoon in Kandahar, they were on a routine patrol when his radio operator spotted something suspicious on the road ahead. James's instincts kicked in immediately. He saw 3 of his soldiers moving toward the area, unaware of the danger. Without thinking, he ran toward them, shouting for them to get back. He reached them just as the improvised explosive device detonated. The blast threw him 15 feet. When he woke up 3 days later in a military hospital in Germany, the world was dark. The doctors explained that the shrapnel had caused irreversible damage to his optic nerves. He would never see again. But those 3 soldiers he'd pushed out of the way? They went home to their families without a scratch. James always said that was worth it, even on his hardest days. Learning to live without sight had been the toughest battle of his life, harder than any combat mission. Simple things that everyone took for granted became mountains to climb. Making coffee, getting dressed, crossing a street, everything required relearning. There were days when frustration overwhelmed him, when he wanted to give up. But his family kept him going. His wife stood by him through every difficult moment, and his 2 grown children visited regularly, refusing to let him sink into despair. Slowly, with training and determination, he built a new life. He learned to use a cane, to navigate by sound, to read Braille, and eventually to help others going through similar struggles. On this particular Thursday, James was feeling good. The weather was perfect, not too hot or cold. He had his routine down and he felt confident and independent. As he approached the crosswalk on Main Street, he heard the familiar sound of the pedestrian signal beeping, telling him it was safe to cross. He stepped off the curb, his cane sweeping left and right as he made his way across the street. That's when he heard it. The aggressive roar of a motorcycle engine, much louder than it should have been and getting closer. James paused for a second, confusion crossing his face. The sound wasn't passing by normally. It was coming straight at him, fast and deliberate. Before he could process what was happening, before he could even think to move, something massive struck him from the side. The impact was brutal. James felt his body lift off the ground for a moment before crashing hard onto the pavement. His cane flew from his hand, clattering somewhere out of reach. Pain exploded through his shoulder and hip where he'd hit the ground. His forehead smacked against the asphalt, and he felt the warm trickle of blood running down his face. For several seconds, he couldn't breathe. The wind had been knocked completely out of him, and he lay there gasping, trying to understand what had just happened. Through the ringing in his ears, James heard the motorcycle engine still rumbling nearby. It hadn't sped away. Instead, it seemed to be circling back. Then he heard the voice, loud, harsh, and filled with venom. The words that came out of the rider's mouth were ugly, hateful slurs that cut deeper than any physical injury. The man was yelling racist insults, laughing about what he'd just done, taunting James as he lay helpless on the ground. James had faced many things in his life. He'd faced enemy fire, the loss of his sight, and countless challenges. But lying there on the street, bleeding and unable to see while this stranger spewed hatred at him, it was a different kind of pain. It wasn't just his body that hurt. Something inside him, his sense of dignity, his belief in the basic goodness of people, felt shattered. The motorcycle engine revved loudly one more time, and then it roared away, the sound fading into the distance. James lay still, his mind racing. He could hear footsteps running toward him now, multiple people rushing to help. Voices surrounded him, some panicked, some trying to sound calm and reassuring. "Sir, don't move, we're calling an ambulance," a woman's voice said close to his ear. Her hand touched his shoulder gently. "I saw everything," a man's voice said angrily. "I got a video on my phone. That maniac hit him on purpose. Someone get his cane, it's over there by the curb," another voice called out. More people gathered around. James could hear at least 5 or 6 different voices now, all trying to help. Someone brought him his cane. Another person had grabbed a clean cloth from somewhere and was carefully pressing it against the cut on his forehead. A young man stayed on the phone with emergency services, describing the location and James's injuries. Through all of this, James remained quiet. He answered the questions people asked him. Yes, he could move his arms and legs. No, he didn't feel dizzy aside from the initial impact. Yes, he knew where he was. But inside, his mind was processing something much bigger than his physical injuries. He kept replaying those hateful words in his head, the deliberate nature of the attack, the laughter in that man's voice. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't some distracted driver who hadn't seen him. Someone had chosen to do this. Someone had looked at him, a blind man crossing the street with a white cane, the universal symbol of visual impairment, and decided to hurt him anyway. Decided to hurt him specifically because of the color of his skin. James had experienced racism before, of course. He'd grown up in the South in the 1960s and 70s, so prejudice wasn't new to him. Even in the military, supposedly one of the most integrated institutions in America, he'd faced subtle discrimination. But this was different. This was violent, public, and personal. It left him feeling vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in years. The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes, though it felt much longer to James. The paramedics were professional and kind, checking his vital signs, stabilizing his neck just as a precaution, and carefully helping him onto a stretcher. As they lifted him into the ambulance, James could hear the crowd of witnesses still talking, their voices angry and sympathetic. Several people promised to give statements to the police. The man who had recorded everything on his phone said he was sending the video to the authorities right away. During the ride to the hospital, one of the paramedics stayed by James's side, monitoring him and making small talk to keep him calm. She asked about his military service, and James found himself talking about it, grateful for the distraction. He told her about his unit, about the good times and the hard times, about the day he lost his sight. She listened quietly, occasionally squeezing his hand in a gesture of support. But even as he talked, part of James's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about what came next. Would they catch the person who did this? Would there be justice? Or would this just be another incident that people would talk about for a few days before forgetting? He thought about his wife, who would be worried sick when she heard what happened. He thought about his children, who would be angry and protective. He thought about the other veterans he worked with at the community center, many of whom already struggled with feeling disconnected from the society they'd fought to protect. Most of all, James thought about that crosswalk, that simple act of crossing a street that he'd done hundreds of times without incident. Would he ever feel safe doing it again? Would he hesitate now, second-guessing every sound, every approaching vehicle? The thought troubled him deeply. He'd worked so hard to maintain his independence, to not let his disability define or limit him, and now in one violent moment, someone had tried to take that away from him. Detective Linda Martinez had been with the Riverside Police Department for 15 years, and she thought she'd seen everything. Domestic disputes, burglaries, the occasional bar fight, that was the usual routine in this quiet town. But when the call came through about a hate crime involving a disabled veteran, something in her chest tightened. She grabbed her jacket and headed out immediately, her partner following close behind. When Linda arrived at the scene, a small crowd still lingered near the crosswalk. Yellow tape had been put up, and 2 uniformed officers were taking statements from witnesses. The bloodstains on the pavement told part of the story, but Linda needed to hear the rest. She approached the witnesses one by one, her notebook ready, her expression serious but calm. The first witness was an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who ran the flower shop on the corner. Her hands were still shaking. As she spoke, she'd been arranging a display in her shop window when she heard the motorcycle engine revving unusually loud. When she looked up, she saw the whole thing happen. The blind man was crossing carefully with his white cane, clearly visible to anyone paying attention. Then this motorcycle came out of nowhere, swerving directly toward him. It wasn't an accident, she insisted. The rider had plenty of room to go around. He chose to hit him. A younger man, probably in his 30s, stepped forward next. He worked at the hardware store across the street and had been outside sweeping the sidewalk. He'd not only witnessed the collision but also heard what happened afterward. His face was red with anger as he described how the motorcyclist had circled back and started yelling slurs at the injured man. The words he repeated made Linda's jaw clench. This wasn't just assault. This was a deliberate act of hatred, but the most valuable witness was a college student who had been waiting at the bus stop. He'd pulled out his phone the moment he saw the motorcycle behaving strangely, and he'd captured everything on video. Linda watched the footage right there on his phone, and what she saw made her sick to her stomach. The video showed James crossing the street, completely vulnerable and unaware. Then came the motorcycle, veering sharply toward him with clear intent. The impact was brutal. The rider's face was visible in several frames, twisted with anger and satisfaction. And then there was the audio, those hateful words screaming at a man who was already hurt and helpless on the ground. Linda asked the student to send her the video immediately. This was solid evidence, the kind that would make any prosecutor's job easier. She thanked all the witnesses and assured them that the police would do everything possible to find the person responsible. As the crowd dispersed, Linda stood at the crosswalk for a moment, trying to understand what kind of person would do something like this. What kind of hatred drove someone to deliberately hurt a blind veteran who was just trying to cross the street? Back at the station, Linda began piecing together the investigation. She reviewed the video frame by frame, zooming in on every detail. The motorcycle was a black Harley-Davidson with custom chrome parts and a distinctive scratch on the fuel tank. More importantly, the license plate was clearly visible in 3 separate frames. Linda ran the plate through the system, and within minutes, she had a name and address. The motorcycle was registered to a man named Tommy Brennan, age 38, living in a trailer park on the outskirts of town. Linda pulled up his record, and her suspicions were confirmed. Tommy had a history of trouble. 2 arrests for bar fights, 1 for disorderly conduct, and several traffic violations. His social media profiles, which Linda accessed through proper legal channels, were filled with disturbing content. Photos of him at motorcycle rallies wearing clothing with offensive symbols, posts sharing conspiracy theories and hateful rhetoric, comments on news articles that revealed a deep-seated prejudice against anyone who didn't look like him. But Linda needed more than social media posts. She needed to place him at the scene definitively and establish motive. She called the hospital to check on James's condition. He was stable, being treated for a concussion, road rash on his arms and legs, and a sprained wrist. The doctors wanted to keep him overnight for observation. Linda decided to drive over and interview him personally. At the hospital, she found James sitting up in bed, his wife beside him holding his hand. His daughter had arrived too, having driven straight from the city when she heard what happened. Linda introduced herself and asked if James felt up to talking. He nodded slowly, his bandaged head turning toward her voice. Linda sat down and asked James to walk her through everything he remembered. He spoke quietly but clearly, describing his morning, his walk to the community center, and what happened at the crosswalk. When he got to the part about being hit, his voice wavered slightly. But what seemed to affect him most wasn't the physical pain. It was those words that had been yelled at him, words that reduced him to nothing but the color of his skin, erasing his service, his sacrifice, his humanity. As James spoke, Linda took careful notes, but she also found herself deeply moved by this man's dignity. Here he was, a decorated war hero who'd given his sight saving others, now lying in a hospital bed because of a senseless act of hatred. Yet he wasn't demanding revenge or speaking with bitterness. He simply wanted to understand why someone would do this, and he wanted to make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. When Linda asked if he wanted to press charges, James didn't hesitate. Yes, he said firmly, not for himself alone, but for everyone who'd ever been targeted because of who they were. His wife squeezed his hand tighter, tears running down her face. His daughter, sitting on the other side of the bed, looked at Linda with fierce determination and asked what happens next. Linda explained that they had strong evidence and would be making an arrest soon. She assured them that the district attorney's office would be involved, and given the nature of the crime, assault with hate crime enhancements, the charges would be serious. James thanked her quietly, then asked a question that caught Linda off guard. He wanted to know about the person who did this. Not his name necessarily, but what kind of life leads someone to such hatred. Linda didn't have a good answer for that. She'd been a cop long enough to know that hate came from many places. Fear, ignorance, being taught prejudice from childhood, feeling left behind by a changing world. But none of that excused what had happened. None of that made it okay to hurt another human being. Before leaving the hospital, Linda spoke briefly with James's family. His wife was struggling to hold it together, alternating between relief that her husband was alive and anger at what had happened. Their daughter was more outwardly furious, demanding to know why someone like Tommy Brennan was allowed to just roam the streets if he had a history of violence. Linda understood their frustration, but she also knew the system had limitations. Until someone actually committed a serious crime, there was only so much law enforcement could do. That evening, Linda worked late preparing the arrest warrant. She compiled all the evidence: witness statements, the video footage, the license plate information, and Tommy's background. She worked with the prosecutor's office to ensure the charges were comprehensive: assault and battery, reckless endangerment, and the critical addition of hate crime enhancements that would significantly increase the potential sentence. By the time Linda went home that night, it was past midnight. She was exhausted but determined. The warrant would be signed first thing in the morning, and they'd pick up Tommy Brennan before noon. She thought about James lying in that hospital bed, about his wife's tears, about his daughter's anger. She thought about the witnesses who'd rushed to help a stranger, who'd stayed to give statements even when it meant being late for work or missing appointments. The next morning came quickly. Linda and 3 other officers drove out to the trailer park where Tommy lived. The place was run down, with rusted vehicles in yards and makeshift repairs on most of the homes. They found Tommy's trailer easily enough. The same black Harley from the video was parked right outside, the distinctive scratch on the fuel tank confirming this was their guy. Linda knocked firmly on the door. "Police, open up!" There was movement inside, some cursing, and then the door swung open. Tommy Brennan stood there in a stained undershirt and jeans, looking exactly like his mugshots. When he saw the officers, he didn't look surprised or scared. He looked annoyed, like they were interrupting something important. Linda showed him the warrant and informed him he was under arrest for assault, battery, and hate crimes. Tommy's reaction was not what most people would expect. He didn't deny it. He didn't ask for a lawyer. Instead, he smirked. He actually smirked and said something about how that blind guy deserved it, how people like him needed to learn their place. The other officers exchanged glances, shocked by his complete lack of remorse. They handcuffed Tommy and led him to the patrol car. As they drove to the station, he sat in the back seat muttering complaints and insults, completely unaware or uncaring that his words were being recorded. At the station, he was processed, fingerprinted, and photographed. His mugshot showed that same defiant smirk, a look that would later cause outrage when it appeared in the news. During the initial interrogation, Tommy showed no sign of understanding the seriousness of his situation. He admitted to hitting James, claimed he was just sending a message to people he felt didn't belong in his town. He used language so offensive that even the experienced detectives in the room were taken aback. Linda had interviewed many criminals over her career, but she'd rarely encountered someone so openly hateful and proud of it. The legal process moved forward quickly. Tommy's arraignment was scheduled for the following Monday. The prosecutor's office was building a strong case, confident that the video evidence alone would be enough for a conviction. But they wanted to be thorough, to make sure every charge stuck and that justice would truly be served. Meanwhile, word of the arrest spread through Riverside. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page, and soon regional news stations picked it up. Social media exploded with reactions. Most people were outraged and supportive of James, but there was also a darker undercurrent. Some people defended Tommy, making excuses or claiming the story was exaggerated. It revealed divisions in the community that many people preferred to pretend didn't exist. The news spread through Riverside like wildfire. By Friday morning, less than 24 hours after Tommy Brennan's arrest, everyone in town seemed to be talking about what had happened. The local newspaper put the story on the front page with a headline that read, "Local Veteran Attacked in Hate Crime." They printed James's military photo from years ago, showing him in uniform with his medals. right next to Tommy's mugshot with that disturbing smirk. The contrast was stark and powerful. By that afternoon, the story had jumped from local news to regional coverage. Television crews from the nearest city, about an hour away, arrived in Riverside setting up their cameras and interviewing anyone willing to talk. The video footage that the college student had captured was played over and over on news channels, though they blurred out James's face and muted the worst of Tommy's slurs. Still, even with the edits, the violence and hatred were impossible to miss. Then social media took hold of the story and everything exploded. Someone created a hashtag that started trending within hours. The video was shared thousands of times. People across the country were suddenly talking about this small town and what had happened on that crosswalk. Comment sections filled up with reactions: anger, sadness, demands for justice, and debates about hate crimes and racism in America. James's phone started ringing constantly. His wife had to unplug it eventually because reporters kept calling, asking for interviews and statements. News vans parked outside their modest two-bedroom house, cameras pointed at their front door, waiting for any glimpse of the family. It was overwhelming and invasive. James had never wanted this kind of attention. He was a private man who valued his quiet life. Now suddenly the whole world seemed to be watching him, but along with the media attention came something unexpected, an outpouring of support from complete strangers. Letters and cards began arriving at their house, sometimes dozens in a single day. People from all over the country wrote to express their sympathy, to thank James for his military service, and to condemn what had happened to him. Some letters included cash donations, $20 or $50 with notes saying they wanted to help with medical bills. Others sent gift cards to local restaurants or grocery stores. James's daughter, who was staying with her parents to help them through this difficult time, decided to set up a fundraising page online. She'd seen other people do this for various causes and thought it might help organize the support that was already coming in. She wrote a simple description of what had happened, included information about her father's military service and his work helping other veterans, and set a modest goal of $5,000 to cover medical expenses and replace the glasses he'd broken in the fall. Within 6 hours, the fundraiser had raised $10,000. By the next morning, it was at $50,000. By the end of the weekend, complete strangers had donated over $120,000. James was stunned. He sat at his kitchen table listening as his daughter read him some of the messages people had left with their donations. Many were from other veterans who felt a deep connection to his story. Others were from people who'd experienced discrimination themselves and wanted to show solidarity. Some were simply from people who were moved by what had happened and wanted to do something, anything, to help. The support was touching and overwhelming, but it also made James uncomfortable in some ways. He didn't want to be seen as a victim or a symbol. He was just a man who'd been trying to cross the street. Yet he understood that his story had touched something deeper in people, had brought to the surface conversations about hatred and prejudice that many communities preferred to avoid. Meanwhile, Tommy Brennan's arrest had stirred up a different kind of response in certain circles. His bail hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, and the judge set it at $75,000, reflecting the seriousness of the charges. Most people assumed Tommy would sit in jail until his trial. He didn't have that kind of money, and neither did his family. But by Tuesday afternoon, to everyone's shock, Tommy walked out of the county jail. His bail had been posted by members of his motorcycle club, a group that investigators were increasingly concerned about. These weren't just guys who liked to ride bikes together. Background checks revealed that several members had criminal records, and their social media presence was filled with the same hateful ideology that Tommy had expressed. They'd pooled their money together to free their friend, and they made sure everyone knew it. They posted photos of Tommy outside the jail, fist raised in the air, looking defiant and unrepentant. This development angered many people in Riverside. How could someone who'd committed such a vicious crime be walking free? Detective Martinez understood their frustration but explained that the bail system wasn't designed to keep everyone locked up before trial. As long as Tommy showed up for his court dates and didn't break any laws, he had the legal right to be out on bail. Still, she made sure that strict conditions were attached. Tommy had to surrender his passport, couldn't leave the county, and had to stay away from James and his family. The tension in Riverside was growing. The town had always prided itself on being friendly and peaceful, a place where people looked out for each other. But this incident had ripped off a bandage and exposed an infection that had been festering underneath. At the local diner, conversations that used to be about weather and sports now turned heated and political. Some people argued that Tommy was just one bad apple and didn't represent the town. Others insisted that this attack couldn't have happened in a vacuum, that it reflected deeper problems with racism and intolerance that the community needed to face. The town council called an emergency meeting to address the situation. The small meeting room was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The council members, looking uncomfortable and unprepared for this level of controversy, tried to moderate as residents took turns speaking. An older black woman who'd lived in Riverside for 40 years stood up and shared her own experiences with discrimination in town. She talked about being followed in stores, about her children being called names at school, about feeling like she always had to be twice as polite and twice as careful to be accepted. Her voice cracked with emotion as she said that what happened to James didn't surprise her at all. It was just the most visible example of something that had been happening quietly for years. A young teacher spoke next, describing incidents at the high school where students had used slurs and hateful language, often without any real consequences. She'd reported these incidents to administrators but felt like they were swept under the rug because people didn't want to admit there was a problem. Now, she said, they couldn't pretend anymore, but not everyone was ready to accept this narrative. A middle-aged man stood up angrily and accused people of making the town look bad, of exaggerating isolated incidents into some kind of pattern. He insisted that Riverside was a good place, that most people here weren't racist, and that everyone needed to stop acting like the whole community was guilty because of what one idiot on a motorcycle had done. This sparked arguments across the room. People started talking over each other, voices rising, fingers pointing. The council members tried to restore order but struggled. The meeting that was supposed to bring the community together was instead highlighting just how divided it really was. Outside the meeting, a smaller group was organizing something different. Pastor Williams from the First Baptist Church, Father Rodriguez from St. Mary's Catholic Church, and Rabbi Cohen from the synagogue in the next town over had been meeting quietly to discuss how their faith communities could respond. They reached out to the local veterans organization, to civil rights groups, and to community activists. Together, they began planning a unity march. The march would walk the same route James had taken that Thursday afternoon, starting at the community center where he volunteered and ending at the courthouse steps. It would be a peaceful demonstration, a statement that the community stood with James and against the hatred he'd experienced. They set the date for 2 weeks away to give people time to plan and to spread the word. As news of the march spread, responses were mixed. Many people immediately said they'd attend, eager to show their support. Local businesses offered to provide water and supplies. The high school principal said students would be allowed to participate with parental permission. But others criticized the march as divisive or unnecessary, as making too big a deal out of one incident. James heard about the march from his daughter, who'd been in contact with the organizers. They wanted his permission and, if he felt up to it, his presence. James wasn't sure at first. He was still recovering physically, still processing everything emotionally. The cut on his forehead was healing but would leave a scar. His wrist was in a brace. The concussion gave him headaches that came and went unpredictably. Beyond the physical injuries, he was struggling with anxiety he'd never experienced before. The sound of motorcycle engines now made his heart race. Crossing streets had become terrifying even though he couldn't see the traffic. But as James listened to his daughter describe the march, something shifted inside him. He thought about all those letters people had sent, about the donations from strangers who'd never met him, about the veterans who'd reached out to say his story mattered. He thought about the other people in Riverside who'd experienced discrimination, but had never had a platform to share their stories. Maybe his reluctant spotlight could serve a purpose. Maybe speaking up was another way to serve, different from his military service, but important nonetheless. James told his daughter to let the organizers know he'd be there. He'd speak if they wanted him to, though he wasn't sure what he'd say yet. He just knew that staying silent felt wrong. His wife worried about him. about the stress and the physical demands of attending a large public event. But she also knew her husband well enough to recognize when his mind was made up. She'd be right beside him, as she'd been for 38 years of marriage, supporting him through whatever came next. In the days leading up to the march, Riverside continued to wrestle with itself. More stories emerged of discrimination and prejudice that had been quietly endured for years. But there were also stories of kindness and solidarity, of people reaching across divides to support their neighbors. The town was changing, forced to confront uncomfortable truths, and no one was quite sure what would emerge from this painful process. The morning of the Unity March arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. It was a Saturday, exactly 2 weeks after the incident that had shaken Riverside to its core. The organizers had been working around the clock, coordinating with police for permits and safety, arranging for sound systems and first aid stations, and spreading the word through every channel they could find. They'd hoped for a good turnout, maybe a few hundred people. What they got was something nobody expected. By 9 in the morning, 2 hours before the scheduled start time, people were already gathering at the community center. They came from all over, not just Riverside but from surrounding towns and cities. Some had driven for hours to be there. The parking lot filled up quickly, then the street parking, then people started parking blocks away and walking to the starting point. Veterans arrived wearing their service uniforms or jackets covered in military patches. Church groups came carrying banners with messages of peace and unity. Families pushed strollers and held the hands of young children. Elderly couples walked slowly but with determination, some using canes or walkers. By the time 11 o'clock rolled around, the crowd had swelled to over 3,000 people. For a town of just 12,000 residents, this was extraordinary. The streets around the community center were packed with bodies, a sea of faces from every background imaginable. People held handmade signs with messages of support. Some signs had James's name on them. Others simply said things like "Love not hate" or "Veterans deserve better" or "We stand together." The energy was peaceful but powerful. Strangers talked to each other, sharing stories about why they'd come. A young mother explained that she wanted her children to see people standing up for what's right. An elderly veteran with a limp and a Vietnam War hat said he'd served alongside men of every race and background, and he couldn't stay home when one of his brothers was attacked. A college student said she'd learned about the incident on social media and felt compelled to drive 3 hours to show her support. James arrived with his wife and daughter at 10:45. They'd planned to come quietly, to blend into the crowd, but word spread quickly that he was there. People began applauding, and the applause rippled through the massive gathering until it became a roar. James stood still for a moment, overwhelmed by the sound, by the knowledge that all these people had come because of what happened to him. His wife held his arm tightly, her own eyes filling with tears. His daughter walked on his other side, proud and protective. The organizers had set up a small stage near the community center entrance. Pastor Williams stepped up to the microphone first, his deep voice carrying across the crowd. He spoke about the values that should unite any community: compassion, justice, and the fundamental belief that every person has dignity and worth regardless of what they look like or where they come from. His words were simple but powerful, and the crowd listened in near silence. Father Rodriguez spoke next, talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan and how it challenged people to see everyone as their neighbor, especially those who were different from them. He said that Riverside was at a crossroads, that they could either pretend this incident was just an isolated event, or they could use it as a catalyst for real change. The crowd murmured in agreement. Then Rabbi Cohen stepped forward. He spoke about his own grandparents who'd survived hatred in Europe, who'd come to America believing it would be different. He said that hatred anywhere was a threat to justice everywhere, and that remaining silent in the face of bigotry made you complicit. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, and people in the crowd nodded and called out in support. Several community members took turns speaking. The high school teacher who'd spoken at the town council meeting shared more about the incidents she'd witnessed and her hope that this moment would lead to real education about diversity and tolerance. A young black man who'd grown up in Riverside talked about always feeling like he had to prove himself, about being stopped by police for no reason, about the casual racism he'd learned to endure. His voice shook with emotion, but he stood tall and finished his speech to loud applause. Then it was James's turn. His daughter helped him up the steps to the stage, and Pastor Williams guided him to the microphone. The crowd fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop among those 3,000 people. James stood there for a moment, his bandaged forehead visible, his wrist still in a brace. He'd thought carefully about what he wanted to say, had even written some notes that his wife had read to him the night before. But now, standing in front of all these people, he decided to speak from his heart instead. His voice started quietly, and the sound technician quickly adjusted the microphone. "I can't see you," James began, "but I can feel you here. I can hear your support, and I want you to know what that means to me." He paused, collecting his thoughts. 2 weeks ago, I was just trying to cross the street. It's something I do all the time, something I've learned to do safely despite losing my sight. But that day, someone decided I didn't have the right to cross that street in peace. Someone decided that the color of my skin made me less than human, made me a target. The crowd was completely still, hanging on every word. James continued, his voice growing stronger. "I served this country for 22 years. I did 2 tours in Afghanistan. I lost my sight saving 3 young soldiers from an explosion, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat." "You know why?" "Because those soldiers were my brothers. One was white, one was Hispanic, one was black. When we were in uniform, facing danger together, none of that mattered. We were just Americans trying to protect each other and do our jobs." He paused again, emotion catching in his throat. "I didn't lose my sight so that I could come home and be attacked on my own streets. I didn't sacrifice so that hatred could win. And I'm not going to let one person's bigotry make me afraid to live my life." The crowd erupted in applause, but James raised his hand to continue. "But here's the thing," he said, his voice softening. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's ever been made to feel less than, who's ever been targeted because of who they are. This is about the kind of community we want to be, the kind of country we want to be. We can either let hatred divide us, or we can stand together and say, not in our town, not anywhere." The applause was thunderous now. People were cheering and crying at the same time. James wasn't finished, though. "I want to thank every single person who came here today. Your presence matters more than you know. But showing up today isn't enough. We need to keep showing up. We need to speak up when we see injustice. We need to teach our children that every person deserves respect and dignity. We need to build bridges instead of walls. That's how we honor not just me, but everyone who's ever fought for a better world." As James stepped back from the microphone, the crowd's response was overwhelming. The applause went on for several minutes. Many people were openly weeping. His wife hugged him tight, whispering how proud she was. His daughter stood beside them, recording the moment on her phone, wanting to preserve this memory forever. The march itself began shortly after, with James, his family, and the various religious and community leaders at the front. Police had blocked off the streets, and the procession moved slowly, 3,000 people walking together in solidarity. They sang songs and chanted peaceful slogans. People along the route came out of their homes and businesses to watch, some joining the march as it passed by. But not everyone was supportive. As the march neared the courthouse, a counter-protest became visible. About 40 people stood across the street, many wearing the same motorcycle club jackets that Tommy Brennan wore. They held their own signs with crude messages, and some shouted insults at the marchers. Tommy himself was there, standing in the front row with that same defiant smirk, clearly violating the terms of his bail that required him to stay away from James. The march organizers had prepared for this possibility. They'd worked with police and trained volunteer peacekeepers to maintain order. Pastor Williams grabbed the microphone from the mobile sound system and called out to the marchers. "Don't engage with them," he said firmly. "Don't give hatred your energy. Keep walking, keep your dignity, and show them that love is stronger than hate." The marchers listened. A few people looked toward the counter-protesters with anger or fear, but most kept their eyes forward, continuing their peaceful procession. The contrast was striking, thousands of diverse people moving together with purpose and dignity, versus a small angry group shouting from the sidelines. Police moved quickly to document Tommy's presence and to keep the two groups separated. Detective Martinez was there in plainclothes, and she immediately radioed for backup. Tommy's appearance at this march, especially this close to James, was a clear violation of his bail conditions. But arresting him right now in front of this volatile situation could turn ugly fast. She made the decision to document everything and deal with it afterward. As the march reached the courthouse steps, the final speakers took their turns. Local politicians who'd initially been silent about the incident now stood up to express support, though some in the crowd viewed this as opportunistic. Student leaders from the high school spoke about wanting to create a more inclusive environment. Business owners pledged to do better about calling out discrimination when they witnessed it. The march concluded with everyone joining hands and singing together. It was a powerful moment of unity, thousands of voices joining as one. James stood in the center of it all, unable to see but feeling the strength of community surrounding him. For the first time since the attack, he felt something other than pain and anger. He felt hope. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached James to shake his hand or hug him. Many thanked him for his courage in speaking out. Others shared their own stories of facing discrimination. An elderly white woman, probably in her 80s, took both his hands in hers and apologized through tears. "I'm sorry this happened in our town," she said. "I'm sorry we haven't done better. But I promise you I'm going to do my part to change things." These personal connections, these individual moments of humanity, meant everything to James. The march had been larger and more public than he'd imagined, but these quiet conversations reminded him why it mattered. The weeks following the march brought significant changes to Riverside, though not all of them came easily. The morning after the Unity March, Detective Martinez filed paperwork to revoke Tommy Brennan's bail. His appearance at the march, directly violating the order to stay away from James and his family, gave the prosecutor's office exactly what they needed. By Monday afternoon, Tommy was back in custody, and this time the judge made it clear he wouldn't be getting out again before trial. Tommy's arrest sparked angry reactions from his motorcycle club friends, but their protests fell on deaf ears. The community had seen enough. Local businesses that had previously tolerated the club's presence started refusing them service. The bar where they regularly met told them they weren't welcome anymore. The owner, a former Marine himself, put up a sign that read, "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who promotes hatred." It was a small stand, but it sent a clear message about what kind of behavior the town would accept. The legal process moved forward steadily. The prosecutor's office assembled their case with meticulous care. They had the video evidence showing the deliberate nature of the attack. They had multiple witness statements all saying the same thing. They had Tommy's own words, both at the scene and later during his arrest, demonstrating his hateful motivation. They had his social media history showing a pattern of racist beliefs. The evidence was overwhelming, but the prosecutor wanted to make sure every detail was perfect. James received regular updates about the case, though he tried not to let it consume his life. He was still dealing with the aftermath of his injuries. The physical wounds were healing, but the psychological impact ran deeper. He'd started having nightmares about the attack, waking up in a cold sweat with his heart racing. The sound of motorcycles still triggered anxiety. His wife noticed he was more withdrawn, spending long hours sitting quietly rather than engaging in his usual activities. His daughter, who'd gone back to her job in the city but called every day, convinced him to talk to a counselor who specialized in trauma. James was reluctant at first. He'd always been someone who dealt with his problems privately, who didn't like to burden others with his struggles. But after a few sessions, he found it helpful to talk through what he was experiencing with someone who understood. The counselor helped him see that his reactions were normal, that trauma wasn't a weakness and that healing would take time. Meanwhile, the fundraising campaign that James's daughter had started continued to grow beyond anyone's expectations. The total had reached nearly $200,000. James and his wife sat at their kitchen table one evening, completely overwhelmed by this generosity. They'd never had much money, had always lived modestly on his military pension and her part-time income. This sudden influx of support felt surreal. After long discussions with his family, James decided what to do with the money. He'd use some for his medical bills and to replace things damaged in the attack. But the bulk of it would go towards something bigger. James wanted to start a foundation that would provide guide dogs and mobility training to disabled veterans who couldn't afford it. He knew from personal experience how life-changing proper training and assistance animals could be. He'd been fortunate to get the help he needed through veteran services, but many others fell through the cracks. This would be his way of turning something terrible into something good. The trial was scheduled for early spring, about 3 months after the incident. Tommy Brennan's public defender tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Tommy refused. Even faced with overwhelming evidence, even knowing he'd likely be convicted, he insisted on going to trial. His lawyer seemed frustrated by this decision, knowing it would only make things worse, but Tommy remained stubborn and defiant. When the trial finally began, the courthouse was packed. Media crews set up outside, and the local newspaper sent reporters to cover every day of proceedings. James attended each day with his wife, sitting quietly in the front row behind the prosecutor's table. He couldn't see the proceedings, but he wanted his presence to be felt. He wanted Tommy to know that he hadn't broken him, hadn't made him disappear or hide. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They played the video for the jury, and several people in the courtroom gasped even though most had already seen it online. Watching it on a big screen in the formal setting of a courtroom made it somehow more real, more brutal. They called witnesses who described what they'd seen, their voices steady but their emotions clear. Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop cried on the stand as she recounted watching James get hit. The college student who'd filmed everything explained how he'd known immediately that this wasn't an accident. Detective Martinez testified about the investigation, walking the jury through how they'd identified Tommy and built the case. She presented his social media history, showing post after post filled with hateful rhetoric. The prosecutor asked her to read some of Tommy's online comments aloud, and the courtroom fell silent as she recited words so vile that several jury members visibly recoiled. Then James took the stand. The courtroom was completely quiet as he was sworn in and took his seat. The prosecutor asked him to describe what happened that day, and James spoke clearly and calmly. He explained his routine, his confidence in crossing that street, and then the sudden violence that had shattered his normal day. He described lying on the pavement, hurt and confused, while someone yelled hatred at him. His voice remained steady, but his wife, watching from the gallery, had tears streaming down her face. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brief and half-hearted. There wasn't much he could argue given the evidence. He tried to suggest that James couldn't know for certain what had happened since he couldn't see, but this argument fell flat. The video showed everything. The witnesses confirmed everything. Tommy's own words at the scene confirmed everything. When it was the defense's turn to present their case, they had little to offer. Tommy's lawyer called a few character witnesses who tried to paint him as a good person who'd made a mistake, but their testimony was unconvincing. One claimed Tommy wasn't really racist, that he just said things he didn't mean when he was angry. But then the prosecutor presented more of Tommy's social media posts, messages, and online activity that showed a consistent pattern of hatred spanning years. Tommy himself chose to testify, against his lawyer's strong advice. It was a disaster. On the stand, he showed no remorse whatsoever. He tried to justify what he'd done, claiming he was just exercising his right to free expression, that he was making a